an amateur radio operator heard an SOS distress call in Welsh, 3,000 miles away from the original Titanic. How is this done? How is this accomplished? And what do you think they said to him when he went and told authorities that the Titanic was sinking? The Titanic has resurfaced in the news lately due to the Titan submarine and its crew that were sadly lost trying to visit the Titanic, trying to get down low enough to see it. Stories kind of abound as to what went wrong. There's a couple of theories out there I've read. I'm not really into predicting or assuming or anything about what happened, but one article I found says the U.S. Navy conducted an analysis of acoustical data and detected an anomaly consistent with the implosion or explosion in the general vicinity of where the Titan submersible was operating when communications were lost. Now, I wonder what type of communications this sub had, because this article that I found, which was actually from this year, talked a lot about how the original distress call from the Titanic in 1912 was heard by an amateur radio operator. So from the BBC News website out here, bbc.com, News UK Wales, this is from May of 2023. This article was posted just this year. So people are still talking about it more than 100 years later. Not to be surprised. Not to be surprised. When the Titanic hit an iceberg while crossing the Atlantic in 1912, April 14th, 1912, it was the morning of. It set sail April 13th, 1912, and it crashed sometime later that night. And I don't know if the exact time is known or not, but I remember April 14th, 1912, because I was in high school when they discovered the wreckage of the Titanic, and I very specifically remember watching that video. It was like on the History Channel or something like that. There was no YouTube back then. But I remember that event happening, and I remember the date, April 14th, 1912, is when it was like 1:30 or 2 o'clock in the morning when it sunk. So when it hit an iceberg while crossing the Atlantic in 1912, it's telegraphers, because they had telegraphy, telemetry, and radio communications on the Titanic. I would like to do a deeper dive into what radios and radio equipment was on the Titanic. Desperately sent out distress calls, hoping somebody somewhere might hear them, but among the first to respond was an amateur radio operator some 3,000 miles away in Wales. Self-taught Arthur Moore received the signal at his homemade station in Blackwood, Caerphilly County. He rushed to the local police station, but was met with incredulity. I know I'm not saying that right, too. Incredulity. Yeah, that. They're like, yeah, right, bro. Sure. Good job. Okay. Yep. Okay, sure. And it goes on to talk about how Artie was known to locals. He had already hit the headlines for his radio equipment a year before the Titanic sank in 1911. He had intercepted the Italian government's declaration of war on Libya, a feat which saw him featured on the front page of the British tabloid newspaper, The Daily Sketch. Sounds a little sketch to me, but moving on. The article continues, people thought he was off his head, and that believing he could intercept signals through bits of wire was something akin to paranormal psychology. So I don't know if he was listening on an actual telegraph system or if he was on a radio. But I can tell you this right now, the Titanic was not on a telegraph system. They're not running a wire out to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. They were transmitting via RF on radio. That was certainly the reaction at the Caerphilly, I'm going to call it Caerphilly, is that okay? Caerphilly police, when in the early hours of April 15, 1912, Artie pedaled to the station to report the Titanic's SOS calls. Today's video is sponsored by Mezzi and Poloni Coax. Mezzi and Poloni Coax is from Italy and makes some of the best coax in amateur radio today. Some of the best connectors for PL259. They make BNC connectors, SMA, reverse SMA, type-in connectors, pretty much all the connectors you can find. And you can always save a 5% discount with the code of KC5HWB listed in the link below. Thank you, Mezzi and Poloni, for supporting this channel. Righty-ho! It's a very British sounding thing. Righty-ho! They said they are said to have mocked him. We'll take a look. Just you get yourself back to bed now and don't bother yourself anymore. All right, dude. However, outside of Wales, Artie was taken very seriously indeed. Soon enough, newspaper reports came through that corroborated every single detail of what Artie had told the police, even down to the Titanic's use of the recently adopted SOS distress signal. there's a history lesson for you. Where did SOS originate from? When was it first used? It was from the days of the telegraph key, which who knows what the first message sent over telegraph was. Put a message below. I want to see if you get it. In Blackwood, it might have been thought of as black magic, but to those who knew and understood, wireless telegraphy was the internet of its day. Amateur radio signals in general, making connections around the world 110 years ago. Yes. Later on, the article talks about how Marconi hired Artie, and together they worked to design the first communications which could reach Britain to the Falkland Islands during World War I. In World War II, he pioneered an early form of sonar technique that uses sound to navigate, measure distances, and communicate with objects in the water. This helped to guide Allied ships around German U-boats in the North Atlantic. Pretty cool picture of some old tech right there. 1985, 73 years after the amateur radio picked up the passenger liner's calls for help, the Titanic's calls for help, it was the sonar technology he pioneered that was used in discovering its final resting place in the Atlantic Ocean. This guy was all over the Titanic. Even after his death, he had help in the Titanic. So, the question is, did the Titan sub have any communications? They have, in this other article I found, couple different articles I found that said that they lost communications with the sub originally. I don't know what sort of... They're not running wires down into the ocean, down into the bottom of the ocean. So there's some sort of wireless communications. And I doubt there's any cell phone towers at the bottom of the ocean. So there's some sort of radiating RF radio frequency being transmitted. And I think I'm going to have to go look up and see what that is, because I'm curious now to see what type of communications. You ever see that movie Crimson Tide? They said to float the buoy and let it take up the VLF antenna, very low frequency antenna. So they use VLF communications in the Navy and submarines, and they're surrounded by salt water, so you would think they'd have a really good ground plane. But this was an interesting story. I thought it fit with all the news articles and news stories that have been in the press recently about the Titanic and about the tragic loss of the Titan sub, which of course was a tragedy, and we don't want to make light out of that anyway. I do like to research stuff like this and see what type of radio communications were used, and perhaps something could be learned from it. Improve upon radio communications for future outings that go deep into the sea. Where do you think he was listening? Radio spectrums, 110 years ago, I don't know what sort of frequency allocations they had for amateurs. Nobody knew what amateur radio was back then, as that police department just said. Where do you think he was listening? In today's world, I would be monitoring the national calling frequencies. Every band has a national calling frequency: 40 meters, 80 meters, 160 meters, 2 meters, 440, AM, FM, CW, single sideband. There's different calling frequencies for every band. So where do you think he was listening? I'd like to know what you think in the comments below.